Us. We shall now begin with the panel discussion. I now call upon stage Ms. Varada Sambos to speak about India, Mr. Rahul Chaudhary to speak about China, Mr. Anay Zogerkar to speak about Israel, Mr. Arvind Nathu to speak about Germany, and also Mr. Shailendra Marathe, who is going to be the moderator. Ms. Varada Sambos hails from Pune. Ma'am has done her BA in Political Science at Savitribai Phule University and MA and MPhil from Center for Political Studies at School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Ma'am has also published her work in various peer-reviewed national and international journals and books and has also participated and presented her work in various international conferences. Ma'am has been teaching for 6 years, starting from Fergusson College, and now is based in Mumbai, teaching at Maharashtra National Law University. I would like to request Mr. Anandu Krishnan to welcome Ms. Varada Sambas. Mr. Rahul Chaudhary hails from Agra. Sir has completed his BA LLB Honours and LLM. Sir is currently studying PhD at NLU Lucknow and has been awarded doctoral fellowship for PhD by ICSSR. Mr. Rahul Chaudhary recently visited China this July as a part of Indo-China Youth Exchange Program and currently is the national co-convener of Think India. I would like to request Mr. Anandu Krishnan to welcome Mr. Rahul Chaudhary. Mr. Anay Zogerkar studied journalism from ICFAI University. He did his BCom from Mullen College, MCom from Business Management from Lala Lajpat Rai College. He is working with the Council General of Israel, Mumbai in political affairs and special projects and also is working with the non-government member executive committee of Rajya Marathi Vikas Sanstha. I would like to request Mr. Sunil Prushti to welcome Mr. Anay Zogerkar. Mr. Arvind Nathu was a scientist at NCL for 30 years and now is a professor and coordinator at IISER Pune. His postdoctoral research include in the Institute of Organic Chemistry, Technical University, Berlin, Germany. His awards include Cross Order of Merit, the highest civilian award by the German President for the Foreigner, Research Ambassador, German Academic Exchange Service, Mentor for chemistry teams at International Chemistry Olympiads in Budapest and Cambridge and Georgia. I would like to request Mr. Sunil Prushti to welcome Mr. Arvind Nathu. We shall now begin with the panel discussion. I hand over the mic to Mr. Shailendra Marathe, who is going to be the moderator.
Thank you. What we thought is, I think in the afternoon, student groups are going to, ideate about how we can use our soft power and various aspects of it, right? And leverage it to become a sort of superpower. So we thought let's understand from some experts in this field who have spent some time from in different geographies, right? So somebody who has understood China well, right? Somebody who has understood Germany well, and see what lessons we can take from those countries when we are talking of leveraging our soft power. So we thought we'll have a panel discussion where we have somebody who can talk about these countries plus how it can fit in the Indian context. That's the whole why we have certain members of on the panel. Right? That's the background. So I'll maybe start with Rahulji. So who has fair amount of understanding of how China has leveraged its soft power. So if we say China definitely today has is a very dominant force in international politics, I can say even military, right? and culturally as well. Because I have made and worked with a lot of Chinese people in India, Australia, Canada, and many other places. They do bring a lot of pride, and sort of they are a very tightly tight community in itself. What is your experience of understanding how China has leveraged its soft power, its culture, etc., to become really a superpower? What's your understanding? What they have done in that direction?
So, very good morning to everyone. So, like China, the soft power, the Chinese experience with soft power is usually goes back to 2007. So, when Hu Jintao, the preceding president of China, started perceived the importance of soft power, and using it to take lead in global markets to project China as a global leader. And his successor, Xi Jinping. So he is vehemently working on how to project China as a soft power. So the things which China is doing, or which what they have done is, they are trying to come up, to make opening their gates to the foreigners, to the students of other nations. Like they are offering more than in 2016 only, there were nearly 440,000 students from across the globe who came to China and studied there. So they are opening the gates for the foreigners to come, mostly youth. They are targeting the youth, who is considered the biggest center of soft power, people who travels across the globe, who are active on social media, who speaks to people. So there were nearly 40,000 students who studied in China. Then the way they have developed their sports infrastructure, that is also very appealing. In 2008, when Beijing hosted Olympics, that was the center of attraction for the entire world. Now in 2016, they have won 71 medals, from 32 in 86 to 71 in 2016 Rio Olympics. So that is also one thing which is, as a sports enthusiast like we Indians are and other countries are, so that's a very big achievement which is pulling interest of the entire world. They have settled sports universities there also. And if we say from other perspective, like media perspective, there are a lot of misinformations regarding China. So they have developed a global network and a local network which is there to curb the misinformation and to project what China holds good for the globe. Thirdly, the movies, the pop culture actually, which pulled everybody to US. The Hollywood, the superheroes like Superman, whatever comic characters, which set in mind of even a child of very young age that US is a superpower. So they started working on it also. Recently, they have released quite a few movies in US and UK and in India also. Like if I go back to my child days or some years back, we used to be a fan of Jackie Chan. So China mein hai, he's a superhero. So like this is how they are now projecting themselves in US also. They have a movie called Wolf Warrior Military Wars, and then the wall. So this is how they are working in every field, be it cinema, be it media, be it the student exchange program, and the biggest, the biggest center of their soft power is their economic and infrastructure development. Like if I say from my personal experience, when I visited China, I was in Beijing for 3 days, Guangzhou and Kunming. So what was the main theme of discussion was those skyscraping buildings. During our stay in Kunming, I stayed on 39th floor. So the entire contingent was so excited with seeing everybody used to, standing at the edge of the room and watching down. Oh, they go choti cars. So this is still a charm which is pulling people. Then the economic independence of the country. Youngsters, they are the way they have come out of poverty, the way they have, accumulated wealth across the sections of society. That is another thing which pulls everybody to China. So it also recently, how Chinese are reacting to Indians, they have been quite accommodative and inclusive throughout my stay in China. And even when I talk to other people, they also say that now there were nearly 30 students who were in Kunming University to study Chinese language. There are students in China who are studying Chinese language in central universities and different private universities which has. So there are nearly 500 cultural exchange centers of China across the world. So this is, I feel, how they are projecting themselves and soft power and how is it helping China. This is what my understanding of China is.
Sure, thanks. When we were pretty young, in school days, Bruce Lee pictures used to get released at that time, and I literally burnt my fingers, put that sand and heat it up and do all those things. I know about that aspect, but I didn't know about some 4 lakh plus students from abroad, going to China for education, because we talk a lot about how US or Australia, right? That education we know, like IDP and other, they host the fairs over here, so we know that.
They have settled Yoga University also. So in Kunming, they have a center on Yoga University where they received 40 applications for graduate course and more than 70 applications for master's course. Like, when I interacted with the professors there, they all were Indians. Now the Indians are teaching in China yoga. So they were also amazed the response they received from the local students there. So that was another aspect which was eye-opening for me also.
Thanks. A lot of learning for us. Anant, sir, you have a lot of experience of going and teaching in Germany. So from German point of view, how Germany has used its soft power. Is it in any way different from how China has used, for example?
Two things. According to me, soft power is a very, very loosely coined word. It doesn't have specific compartments and it cannot be tabulated. Many people include digitalization, enterprise, education, culture, practically everything that cannot be included in the hard power. So although it is this is a really new concept introduced by Joseon Nye, probably in 1980, somebody said 2008, but I think it was, so I'm still going back perhaps. And that is just to measure when the Cold War was coming to an end and it's very difficult to judge the people say how to influence the people in the other country and so on and so forth. Of late this has been quantized to some extent by using some kind of measures, giving points and all the things, and that is called Software 30 or Portland Power, and there are several agencies which do that, and they do it every year. As in the beginning Vijay said, your soft powers are really good, but the hard powers are better. That is true. Because unless otherwise you have soft powers backed by the very hard or the political determination, that will not work. One of the best examples is our beginning when we were young in terms of independence in our China policy or Kashmir policy. For example, we were Hindi Kini Bhai Bhai, but it was not backed by the real hard power, so it never worked. Similar is the case to the Kashmir. Very striking similarity between this thing came in last few years, from 2005 to 2017, practically in Germany. By the way, before I start, I would like to say that I am a spectator to German politics from 1976. Because when I entered into Germany first time in 1966, there was a president election between Helmut Kohl and Helmut Schmidt. So from that till 2018, when I keep on visiting, I see the changing scenario in Germany. So 2005 to 2017, more or less with some kind of turbulence from the FDP and some other cases. Most of the time things were getting smooth from SPD, so to say, without any problem it is going to CDU, and for last year with Helmut Kohl it continued, with Angela Merkel it went very well. Even for the last coalition it's okay. Real problems start in 2017 when actually Angela Merkel has problems in establishing her own government. 6 months just went by talking to SPD, that is another coalition partner. Not only she lost 6 months, but when ultimately they joined upon the government, she has to lose a lot of things to SPD. She could not exert her own problem, and that has given a sort of, I won't say instability, but not a very comfortable situation in that case. And in addition to that, she had the internal party. There was a lot of opposition project within the party because of her immigration policy. So these two have little brought down little bit, and that has immediately reflected into the soft power index. In 2013-14, they were number 1 for 2-3 years, and now slided down to 5, not gone back to, sorry to say about the China or Russia, which have stand on 27th and 28th, but they have gone down. That's why I said soft powers needs to be back. And then there were many, many more effects, especially in the education, in the area of education where I am concerned. Education, language, and all other things which we can discuss. And this was felt more because of the generally the two dadas, US and Russia, they are building. But we realize that this is probably the first time that the US is slightly making some vacancy or some space for the world leadership. And that is where probably Angela Merkel should pay. And in the President Macron, she is a very forceful partner for European values. So now they are trying to establish all the European values, multidimensional international cooperation, and so on and so forth. So I thought this is the right platform to start a new era, and they have started. Perhaps in the flow of information, especially in the field of education, I can continue it.
Thank you. So I think Germany has been one of the major driving forces behind EU, right? So I think, and they have been sort of keeping it together and supporting it monetarily in a big way. So, Anay sir, from your experience of working with Israel, right? How do you look at it? It's a very tiny sort of city country, we can say, right? Almost, and still it has very played its cards very, very wisely. It's a force to reckon with in international politics, right? So what is it that has allowed them to do it? Sort of pull their weight above whatever their actual weight is.
First of all, a disclaimer: I work with the Israeli consulate, but I'm not representing the state of Israel because only Israeli diplomats can do it. I'm an Indian citizen, so I will share my personal view. Yes, you are very right. Israel became independent just 9 months after India's independence. And at the time of independence, its population was only 6 lakhs. And within 10 years of its independence, it took 1 million refugees from the Jewish refugees from the Arab countries. And so even the founding fathers of Israel were not sure whether this country will last more than few decades because the challenges were so severe. And yet, in 1957, 1958, Golda Meir, who later became the first woman Prime Minister of Israel, that time she was the Foreign Minister of Israel, and according to Ben Gurion, she was the only man in the cabinet. She started Mashav, or Israel's International Developmental Cooperation Program. You have to understand that it started before USAID, it started before international development cooperation programs of many other countries. And there was some kind of a strategy to project Israel's soft power, because around that time the world was divided into 2 groups because of Cold War. Large number of developing countries were part of, they were out of this group under the non-alignment movement. And for Israel it is very important to have build relations with dozens of African and Asian countries with which it did not have any formal relations. And so Israel decided to share its learnings, its know-how in the field of agriculture, in the field of water, in the field of medicine to developing countries, particularly in Africa and in Asian countries, under this international developmental project. Again, compared to the development programs of large countries like US, Germany, China, it's a very tiny organization with a shoestring budget. But in the last 60 years, Mashav has trained more than 3 lakh people, professionals, in more than 132 countries. And many of the people who were trained by Mashav later became, some of them became prime ministers of their respective countries. Many of them are members of parliament or ministers, including in India, there are people who were Mashav students and now who are members of parliament. So that is the government, the developmental cooperation arm of the Israeli foreign ministry. That is one thing. Second point I would like to mention is about Israel is a Jewish state. And it is also a holy land for three major religions in the world: Judaism, Islam and Christianity. And since the beginning, Israel was and it has been projecting its place as a holy land and also as a Jewish state to build support all over the world. When it comes to the Jewish communities all over the world, we have to understand that Jewish people came from more than 70 countries around the world into Israel. And still there are significant Jewish communities. Until even last 5 years back, the largest number of Jews used to live in the United States, not in Israel, and also in several European countries, including France and even in Morocco, in India, you name it. And in building relations with these communities, Israel tried to create or project its image all over the world, and it undertook several programs. These programs including like Birthright Israel or Taglit, to get young Jewish diaspora people to Israel, learn what Israel is, and they used to become cultural ambassadors of Israel in their respective countries. Also programs like Masa, like where scientists, social activists, young political leaders, they were provided opportunities to work, to volunteer, to spend some time in Israel. This was the diaspora issues. When it comes to other religions, whether it is Islam or Christianity, Israel tried to reach out to other countries as a holy land. Whenever the Pope visits Israel, the Israeli Foreign Ministry or Israel projects it as an important global event, and in a way it tries to reach out to the Christian faithful community around the world. From time to time it organizes interfaith dialogues with major religions in the world. The Foreign Ministry of Israel has a Department of Jewish Affairs and also interfaith or religious affairs within the Foreign Ministry, so it is also done as a part of the government project. When it comes to development part, again the agriculture and water, as we are all aware, Israel invented drip irrigation system. It demonstrated to the world how to use more efficiently resources like land, water, and this kind of what Israel has done has like some kind of a global impact. Even farmers in Maharashtra look at Israel as a Krushi Pandari, or all over the world they treat it as a pilgrimage. And so Israel tries to boost its advancements in all these areas. Water has now become one of the most important aspects of the Israeli diplomacy or projecting soft power, because everywhere in the world we are facing water shortages. And in this effort, even the Prime Minister of Israel or the top leadership is not behind. The Prime Minister goes on Facebook Live, and let's say Israel has difficult relations with Iran. So Prime Minister goes on Facebook Live and appeals to the people of Iran that, look, you are facing drought and we have water technologies. Your government doesn't want to establish relations with us, but we are ready to share our water technologies with you. Or even in the case of sports, when an Iranian wrestler was asked by the government to lose against a Russian wrestler because he would not face the Israeli wrestler in the next round, the Israeli Prime Minister went on live and he appealed to people of Iran like, you are feeling disheartened because your wrestler has lost. I am also feeling disheartened because I want your wrestler to play against my wrestler. And so in a way they are using this very efficiently. Again, when we talk about public diplomacy, this kind of change came to Israeli foreign policy around 2008-9. And the thinking behind it is all of us, different countries have conflicts, some of with their neighbors, some with other countries. And we try to convince the other countries in the world that they should support us and not the country, our adversary. But the new thinking came into mind, but we don't care about whether the world is interested in our conflict or not. So if two of us have any problem and we go to a third country and both of us try our best to convince them, that country will give you 5 marks each, because they are not interested in your conflict and they are not party to your conflict. So if you want to turn other countries to your side, you have to share with them, you have to tell them the things that they are interested in and not the things that you want to tell them. So instead of talking about conflict with the Palestinians or Arabs or neighbors, Israel decided that to restrict this kind of political discourse only with countries that have a say or that have a role in this politics. With other countries, you have to talk issues which have a mutual interest. That could be agriculture, that could be water, that could be employment, entrepreneurship. And it brings me to the last point, where now Israel is in a major branding exercise. It wants to project itself as a startup nation. and a country where the highest number of startups after US, Canada, and maybe after China, they are registered, highest number of per capita startups, the highest amount of GDP spent on R&D. So in a way it is a very well thought branding exercise, and as part of it the government of Israel is offering a number of scholarships to young entrepreneurs, special kinds of visa. With India now we started off India Bridge program, under which Israeli startups are encouraged to come to India and develop their products for Indian market. Both governments have already started a joint funding mechanism, about $40 million over a period of 5 years, where young entrepreneurs from India and Israel will work together in teams, and both of them, such companies, will get funding from the government. Israel is already offering postdoctoral scholarship for Indian and Chinese students, and 80% of those scholarships are backed by Indian students, not by Chinese students. So these are some of the things I would like to start with, and there are some other issues which I will mention.
Thanks, Anuj. I think one thing you mentioned about sort of talking to other countries what is of their interest, right? So I think India has started doing it much more effectively now. So sort of the term which is used is de-hyphenation of India Pakistan, right? That joint word which used to dominate our discourse in the world. That is, I think, a good lesson to learn from Israel as well. So Vardha ma'am, historically, I mean, we are one of the oldest civilizations in the world. We were pretty strong economically, right? So we had about 30-35% of world GDP just few centuries back, a few generations back actually, right? From there, definitely there has been a certain path downhill for various reasons. But how effectively have we tackled this? How effectively have we taken this in our control post-independence, and how have we fared? What is your point of view on that? I think Chautai ji mentioned a bit about how it is getting sharpened now. But what is your point of view? Post-independence, how have we handled this?
Thank you, Shailendra. Good morning to one and all present here. And I would also like to thank the organizers, Think India, for giving me this opportunity to present my views. I'll start, and since I come from much more academic background and essentially teaching, I'll have some structure in this small presentation. I'll start, of course, my favorite forte is theory, and sir talked about Joseph Nye. So let's first try and understand how do we look at soft power. Are we putting soft power in juxtaposition to hard power, and how do we differentiate between the two? If hard power is something about military, if hard power is something about the security personnel, if hard power is something also about economic, and then the necessities required for strengthening your economies, what does get counted in soft power? So we have been talking about language, or maybe water, or maybe religion, etc., etc. So many things would come under culture, many things would come under soft power as well. Now, very typical way of looking at hard power and soft power, and of course I'm not going to go into deep theory, but very simplistic way to understand this can be, hard power is very violent in nature, because you are talking about standing armies, you are talking about infrastructure needed for that security, as against, and of course hard power is far more based on the idea of relative gain, which is a very popular concept also in international relations, as against which soft power is far more mutual benefit. Soft power is far more non-violent means of having diplomatic relations, of having international balance of power. Now, with this background, let me start working and to respond Shailendraji's question, how have we been doing after independence? But even before starting to talk about after independence, we need to get ourselves very clearly positioned in terms of where are we standing in the global scenario today. So I'm going to go backwards in terms of where are we today, and then going back to the immediate post-independence era. So today, what is India? What is it that India has to offer? And again, connecting the point to Anaisa's presentation, what does India has to offer to the world? What are our strengths? If at all we want to talk about soft power, and again substantiating to the point given by Arvind sir, there is no soft power, or you cannot materialize soft power without having substantial hard power. So your soft power would make sense only if you have a very strong and boosting economy. You have something to offer to the world at the level of economy as well as at the level of security. So we need to get ourselves very clear on the terms of whether we have these two, and then moving on in terms of what is then that India has in much more civil society. Am I audible there? Yeah. So what is it that India has to offer in terms of much more in terms of civil society? If hard power is something which is concerned absolutely with the state, soft power is far more civil society and what we generally term as non-state actors in international politics. Now with this, what is it that India has to offer to the world? Definitely the diversity that India has. In fact, the very fundamental understanding of India for centuries has been it's a chaotic country. Now inevitably it is going to look chaotic from outside because people just don't understand the order of chaos. But this chaos is something which is beautiful thing, and especially when we start talking about enlightenment rationality and how it got bursted with 2 world wars, what we see is this chaos is very beautiful. This order of chaos is very beautiful, and this diversity of cultures, language, religions, races, and you name it, the diversity is available here. So that's a very, very fundamental point that India has to offer. So India is nowhere near the project of homogenization, but what we do, we have been, and as part of our civilization, we have been working on celebration of diversities. So this is something, so people, those who keep telling us what is tolerance, people, those who keep telling us what is equality, what is liberty, what is democracy, we need to tell them, oh look here, we have this tradition of plurality. So this is one. Secondly, also talking in terms of modern democracy, India is proven a successful democracy itself. One of the most vibrant democracies as well as largest democracies of the world. So that is something that India has to offer. So generally the comparisons are drawn between India and China, and why India fares far better than China. The precise reason is this democracy. Again, from typically Western point of view, we do have this Western notion of democracy, and which then becomes a very strong hold of India. Talking in terms of the dynamics of population and demography, yes, India is the youngest country and we are the future. We all know what is the age gap that China is facing, and India, it seems next 30 years it's India who is going to rule. So also in terms of human resource. And last and very important, which of course where we are in very tough competition only with China, I would say, not with the West, not with even the Far East. This aspect that is a very strong hold of India, and what India has to offer as part of its responsibility is its immense development of spiritual sciences. So if the West we have been looking at as science of material, what India has been doing for ages and centuries is science of soul, what we are considering today as spirituality. So be it in terms of yoga, be it in terms of meditation, so what India needs to offer to the world, and why would India has far better solutions to anybody else? Because everybody else would be talking about soft power to substantiate their material power, to substantiate their hard power itself. What India has its differences with, or what is unique about India is this spiritual understanding, which is not centered around this material understanding, but something far beyond embracing Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So this is something which makes India stand apart from most of the countries, and why would India fare far better as far as soft power is concerned. But after putting India in this context, what are the concerns that we have to take into consideration? We are part and parcel of somebody else's project of soft power. And now I come back to post-independence era. We have been adopting those Western monolithic ideologies, those Western meta-narratives, which never suited India. Be it in economy, be it in terms of mixed economy, or the idea of planning, or the idea of secularism that has been borrowed from the West, or the typically Western understanding of democracy in terms of institutions. Whatever institutions we have today, including judiciary, are something which are based absolutely on Western understandings. Now, what problem we have with this idea? We are working on the agenda which was set for us by somebody else to enhance their soft power. And we are still working on that agenda. So, if at all I want to use Rajiv Malhotra's phrase, the breaking India forces, where is this coming from? Where is this idea of Aryan and Dravidian coming from? And unfortunately, in India, in academics, we are still working on the same narratives which were given to us by the colonizers. So we are still working on the soft power provided to us, and we are still the victim of the soft power targets which we were during colonial era, and that kept continuing till very recent year, with few exceptions in the coalition era, where of course there had to be different kinds of opinions to be taken into consideration, and of course with the clear majority of BJP government, we are moving little towards our indigenous understanding of our national interest. So if there are more questions, I'll be very happy to answer them, and this is my submission. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Vardaji. Thanks for defining what soft versus hard power means. I should probably ask that open question to all of you first. And then 4 aspects you mentioned: diversity, democracy, the favorable demographics, and the spiritual sciences as something that we can give to the world. And 2 concerns: we are adopting the Western ideologies frameworks, and the second is the agenda is not being still set by us, right? What we should offer. I just on diversity, I'll just recount one of my experiences. I was in UK. This is around 1995 or so. And in a hotel we were having breakfast, and one of my colleagues from France had come there, and she, over breakfast, she just asked me a question. I almost choked up, right? She asked me, what is your national dish, right? And I was like, my head was spinning for some time. What is this national dish, right? And then she explained something that we have, let's say on a Sunday morning, family will cook and sit together, and at least 1,000 dishes flashed in front of me, right? You can understand why my head was spinning. I mean, I could say at least 100 Maharashtrian dishes itself. So we should definitely think and set agenda in our terms. People don't even understand that this country doesn't have a concept of national dish, and that doesn't mean this country is not united or it doesn't have its, something to offer. So thanks. Just few more questions. So I think, unfortunately, we have just got about 1 hour. So Rahulji, one key thing, and developing on what Vardaji mentioned, China is a central, model, right? Communist model, where they have much more liberty in terms of how they set and drive their agenda, right? There must be fights before that agenda comes out. But once it is there, right? We remember Tiananmen Square, for example, right? They will simply run roughshod over whoever is there. Whereas India probably, in my opinion, has sometimes too much of democracy, right? Again, I may not be correct, because I think it's good to have a vibrant democracy, of course. So how does that does it put any kind of constraints on us, or is it something that will help us having that much of a democracy?
When we talk about China, the first thing comes to our mind is the democratic setup. We Indians, I not say we adopted it after independence, we had it since ancient time. So we always had freedom. Like China, the way it has been colonized or tried to colonize by Britishers, Japanese and others, it has developed a sense of insecurity amongst them. But to say that there is no freedom, that they drive their agenda, that might not be true in present context. So when Chinese talk about communism, they say communism with Chinese characteristics. So that is not the communism model which they have directly borrowed and implemented like we communists do in India. Right? They borrow it from Russia, try to implement it in India. They borrow it from China and try to implement it in India. But rather Chinese, they are focusing on communist model with Chinese characteristics, and they are very outspoken about it in their practice and in their theories. So when it comes to India, then usually it is a local affair for them. See, despite this, the India and China is the biggest trading partner of India. So our trade at current stands somewhere near $80 billion, US $80 billion. So which we are seeing to reach by $100 million, say. So that has not been ever been a conflict between India and China. That is the local affair, how they manage their country. So when it comes to dominance, yes, definitely there has been some incidents where they have given monetary aid to some countries, and then they have tried to sort equity. If they can't pay back loan, they are seeing equity from the countries. Maybe that is one word of caution for every country, or an act of caution, which India is very clear, like we have strong reservations with respect to one border, one road. That is, so there are issues which usually pops up because of the different mindset and how the country they are governing and we are governing. So I don't think it will be a very point of contradiction, or rather a point of break where we break our conversation with China. It will continue, it has continued, it has developed with time. And now, like, if I say from my personal experience, so like usually they are trying to connect to India. So on the very first day when I reached Beijing, so the person who was taking guiding our guide, so she told us, like, you have concept of Mother River. We also have Mother River. Like you say, Mother India. Our land is also very holy to us. So they are trying to connect with Indians in the Indian way, right? So this is the one thing which I perceive there. So does everybody else would have. And secondly, like they are trying to rejuvenate the Silk Route. We have been the oldest trade partners. So now China is speaking of rejuvenating Silk Route. That is also one aspect that they are trying to seek Indians, or more and more engagement with Indians. And like recently on a visit to Ahmedabad, when Xi Jinping visited Ahmedabad, he said we will offer 10,000 scholarship to students to come and study in China. So with the local, how they govern their local structure, how they govern their country, that is altogether a different aspect, right? So I don't think that will be a hindrance in Indo-China relationship ever.
Great, thanks. So I think what you are looking at is we can be more of collaborators than competitors, right? But I think the unfavorable balance of payments will definitely be something that will haunt us. So great. So Anantji, if you look at Germany, it has got a very different background. Beginning of last century, it went through 2 world wars, which it initiated, right? There was a Holocaust, and definitely the image of Germany to the world was something very, very different, right? So how did they recover from it, and how they changed themselves, and how they managed to change the perception of the world towards them?
You are right. It is very difficult to, whatever you do, still the old memories of the Second World War have not gone from the minds, not only from the Germans, but those who are looking from the outside also, they are not forgotten. Germans are trying to very hard to forget those memories by recovering, and perhaps in 19 fall of Berlin Wall has really helped us to help them to join the things. But as I said, still the old memories die hard. But now in 2 aspects it is coming up very well. Number one is the fall of Berlin Wall and so-called meeting of East and West together, and so on and so forth. And the second thing that has really helped us is the young generation. The young generation in Germany as on today, well, if you ask them about the Second World, yes, there was a Second World, we remember, but that didn't have any direct impact on them. Directly, indirectly they may be, but directly. So that is not the story with the last generations. So slowly, those war memories are German government is trying very hard to forget those war memories, but it's very difficult, and still many times that those bad memories, they still haunt the Germans. How they have forgotten, after forgetting these things, Germany's first few years, maybe 20 or 25 years, were spent in trying to settle down the financial things. Because they started with 0 ashes, they got the Marshall Plan, they got the labor from Turkey, still it took a lot of time to establish the normal life. And once they establish the normal life, they start playing a tool or using the tool of software. Then you start. First thing was in the field of education. The only thing, the only unique program they are having is the language schools in India, or practically everywhere. The very fact that Gede Institute worldwide is known as Maxwell Bhavan in India is the first effort towards the Indianization. This is the first towards this thing. It caters to practically German teaching of German language right from the school level to the top level. In fact, India is one of the topmost level is called Oberstufe. That is done maximum in India. There are 3 centers, where worldwide there are very few. So language, they realize that is one of the soft tools that can be used everywhere, and they have effectively used in India, right from school to the bottom. Second, coming most importantly to the area of education. There were few exchanges earlier and all the things, but they were not very serious. When they realized that why the Indian or any students are reluctant to come to Germany, whereas they prefer to go to the US or UK, as on today's figures also they say, show the same thing. There are 2 major stumbling blocks which they were trying to remove. First stumbling block was the internationalization of product. Till that time they were taking pride that all courses are in German, our PhD has to be submitted in German, which they started diluting later on. And now there are more than 180 international projects. When I say international project, it means it can be done in English. Now you can submit the thesis on English. So these were the 2 stumbling blocks. One was the language, and the second was the ease of operation of the universities. This is number 1. Number 2, they made realize that education system which takes care of 5 years integrated programs after 12 or at the end of school. That was one of the major stumbling blocks for aligning with the world. World goes with the bachelor's and master's schools. These are the intricacies, but that has really helped. So in last 10 years, now Germans have completely changed their education systems to bachelor's and master's. So bachelor's of master's system and the German language, doing away with the German language, most of the courses, that has really helped. As far as the Indian statistics is concerned, in last 6 years, Indian students, I don't have other statistics, but Indian students going to Germany has multiplied 4 times because this ease of operation. So in terms of education, they had the higher standard, but it was not accessible to the world. So in their effort of internationalization, they acquired these 2 points. Next came the idea of research. In Germany now they have started 2 kinds of different research programs, where you don't have to bother, you straight away go to the professor and ask whether he can do PhD with you. There is a systematic program, there is a direct program, through which that has eased out the way for the research. And the one more step they have taken is the establishment of DWA, how you translate, German House of Innovation. In the world now they established 4 German House of Innovations. One of them fortunately is in Delhi, and that coordinates all the research funds, all the educational institute, everything under one roof. So information wise it's much accessible. Then they also encourage the innovation in doing this. They also help you at all the levels of education, right from the postgraduate. The only gap that they had was the undergraduate. How to encourage? They have started sandwich courses. That is one of the unique adoption in the terms of education. That you do part of your research here, go to Germany, finish the research and come back. So these kind of now sandwich courses are awarded. But the most important, the new program that has started with the 50 years cooperation of Indo-German collaborations in education was most important program called WISE. That the student before he finishes BA or bachelor degree, will get an international exposure in Germany for 3 months. This is a new kind of internship. It has started. You can take the experience in the industry, you can do it in university, and you can do it anyway. And the only one of the things that was disturbing to others was various funding agencies, German German Research Society, von Humboldt, DAD, and all the things. Now they have been all brought under one roof called German House of Innovations. So with this infiltration into the education and the research, now I think Germany is using their soft tools very economically. And the third most important part is the industry of this thing. It has really helped us, although industry doesn't fall directly within the soft tools strictly, but that has created a lot of employment, and that has become a soft tool. For example, now there are in Pune alone, in last 10 years, there are more than 750 various kind of German industries, whether it is small, big, right from Mercedes to top down to this. So that is also a way into earning, using the soft tools for the betterment. And then lastly follow the culture. Culture is something now that is being introduced, and Maxima Bhavan is also playing it. On lighter side, I can say now you can have Oktoberfest, which is a famous German fest, also in. So all the three levels they are playing. At cultural level, a new initiative called Berlin Künstler has started. What does it mean? There are 100 programs in a year where a foreigner or an Indian player can go and play their music for 2.5 hours. It will be partially supported after selection by the German government. And therefore now they are called Berlin and Hamburg as 24-hour cities where there are a lot of cultural activities and all things are going on. Perhaps later on I'll stop here, mainly dealing with the education, science and industry and the innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Initially we spoke about, I think, Choudhary spoke about how Indian diaspora, right? So how it is now strongly connecting back to India, right, with its identity. Israel also has a very strong diaspora, right? So India, for example, the persecuted Jews migrated like probably 100 other communities to India hundreds of years back, and many of them went back, but some stayed back in India. So they are a diaspora for Israel. Many of the Nobel scientists happen to be Jews, right? So they are diaspora. How has that diaspora contributed back to Israel, and how Israel is managing that relationship? Is there something that we can learn out of that?
Yes, definitely, there are few similarities and few major differences. As I earlier said, Israel is a migrant country. I mean, Jewish people, it did not exist before 1948. Jewish people across the world came to Israel, settled there. Many of them came without any wealth. And it was always important for Israel to have maintained relations, strong relations with its diaspora. Israel was born because of the UN partition of Palestine, both in 1947, and US and Russia and major Western countries played a very important role in dividing Palestine into Jewish and Arab state. So in continuation of this support, it was important for Israel to have good relations with diaspora. At the beginning, the diaspora was source of investment in Israel, financial aid to Israel, sharing of its experience to Israel, because it was very difficult for a country which without any natural resources to feed 6 lakh people, and in addition where population of Israel grew almost 15 times in the last 70 years. So it was important to have support of the other countries, and in which diaspora used to play an important role. Now things have changed. Now Israel has the highest number of, I mean, in the Jewish population, Israel has the highest number of Jews, even more than United States. It's a fairly mid-income country with per capita income more than $40,000, and it is not dependent as such on foreign aid or the diaspora aid as it used to be. But like you said, the Jewish diaspora in the Western countries, they are very well placed. They are among the top scientists, top researchers, they are politically very well connected. So Israel needs their help. To do this, they have created a lot of channels. These channels were started even before the establishment of the State of Israel through Jewish Agency. And Jewish Agency, before Israel was born, was an entity which established channels with diaspora in respective countries and the Jewish people there. Through Jewish Agency, they start addressing the various challenges faced by the Jewish diaspora in this country. Like I said, there are different programs for youth. The Jewish youth, there is this birthright program where every Jewish youngster gets a chance at some point of his life to visit Israel and spend a month there, spend 2 weeks there. These programs are fully funded by the government of Israel or Jewish agencies. There is a Jewish National Fund. There are organizations for women. There are organizations for Jewish professionals to get connected. Then when it comes to diaspora, there are needs like the religious law, whether it comes to Hebrew language, whether it comes to Jewish customs, such things are also taken care of. Israel in general, there is a very strong culture of voluntarism. So the Jewish youth or Israeli youth, when they go outside, they are encouraged to contribute for the communities there, not only Jewish community. Right now when I am saying this, there is a group of 40 Israeli students from the College of Management who are staying for last 2 weeks in Wada, in a tribal belt of Palghar district, and they have painted the Jilla Parishad school there. And when they started working there and laboring with the school children, the Indian community there also, they get encouraged and they joined, and now there are more than 100 people working for the improvement of school. So in a way, these were the youngsters who come to India after their army service. About 40,000 Israeli youngsters come to India. So it was really a challenge to motivate some of them, like, anyway you are going out as a tourist, why not to contribute 2 weeks of your stay out of 3 months for the social welfare. And in this the diaspora thing comes up. Again, India was a country, one of the very few countries where Jewish people are living for more than 2000 years. But probably it is one of the only country or very few countries where there is not a single case of persecution against Jewish people, and that is because the overall tolerance that we have for centuries, like Professor Varada said. And from other countries in the world where Jewish people have migrated to Israel, in a way they have forgotten their ancestral languages, they have forgotten their culture. But Indian community in Israel is such that it has kept its Indian entity alive. There is a Marathi quarterly magazine called as My Boli, which still publishes in Israel. Various Marathi plays, Indian plays are performed in Israel. 2 years back we started, Tel Aviv University became the first university to teach Marathi in Tel Aviv, and we often say that the highest concentration of Marathi people outside India is in Israel, wherein in small area about 85,000, 80,000 people live. So it is important aspect of the Israeli foreign policy to connect with the diaspora. There are issues with diaspora where it needs to address, like in several European countries now. There are this issue about the Jewish kosher meat and culling because of the animal cruelty issues. In some countries they are banned. In some countries this Jewish ritual of circumcision is been banned because this is not. So in such cases the government reaches out to the community and tries to address it. And one last more important thing is when it comes to disaster management or relief and rehabilitation efforts, Israel has developed a unique ability where in a record number of time they can go out and set up a field hospital or relief for that country. Even in Kerala floods, right now already 2 trucks of like the Israelis in India, they contributed, and without getting into the debate about whether it should be done or not, with the help of Indian authorities, it reached out to the people. Even in Bhuj after the earthquake, Israel was the first country to set up a field hospital in Bhuj. And such efforts, which are not very large in its size, but they affect people, and that they develop people-to-people relationship. And that there the diaspora is like, as I said, the bilateral relations between 2 countries are like earlier they used to be dominated by the friendship between 2 leaders or 2 armies or 2 governments. Then the the relations between institutions like universities, colleges, companies, they start to matter. And now in the age of internet and social media, it's at the end of the day, it is people-to-people relations. And in developing these people-to-people relations and creating awareness about Israel, diaspora, Jewish diaspora all over the world play an important role. And in a way, in US now we are seeing that there is very, like Prime Minister Netanyahu said during his visit to India, in Silicon Valley, native English is a rarely spoken. What you often hear is Hindi and Hebrew. So that way, the both communities are very strong in Silicon Valley, and they are working together, and their friendship, their working together is helping Israel also, and it is helping India as well.
Thanks. I think one collaboration, I don't know whether to put it as soft power or hard power, but intelligence cooperation that Israel shares, right? You may not speak about it. That has actually probably helped it in terms of, gaining some kind of a friendship across the nations. Vardaji, you talked about four things, democracy, diversity, etc. So in terms of, let's say, if I have to look at it as a company or a corporate, right? What are the different products that we can take to market, right? I'm giving Ayurveda as an example. We can take Sanskrit language as an example. Maybe we can talk of architecture, music. What are the different things that India can give to the world? I mean, those four, of course, I understood what they are. But in terms of spirituality and arts, etc., what are those things?
I think we need to also understand, and again connecting to Anayji's point, we also need to understand, so if we are offering market to the world, and if the world is understanding what Indians want, and as Sir also talked about how Goethe Institute becomes maximum in India, some similar kind of exercises we need to do even to reach out to the markets out there. So thinking in terms of Ayurveda, and we also need to very strongly, like one of my students is now working on pharmaceutical medicines and how it has been opposed by the global pharmaceutical giants, something like Novartis. So as against, so even when there is so much of struggle to establish even the generic medicines, how do we start popularizing even something like Ayurveda? Yesterday I was reading in the newspaper that Harvard has come up with this latest research on coconut oil. After so much of talking about how coconut oil is bad for cholesterol and how it hampers your heart, then there was the entire wave wherein the keto diet actually survived on coconut oil, and yesterday's newspaper again told us how coconut oil is poisonous. Now what we need to understand is also the politics of generation of knowledge, which is a very important part of soft power, and what in terms of corporate, what is it that India has to offer to the world? There are so many, like if you look at Art of Living or even Sadhguru, Isha Foundation, so all these people, they are trying to reach out in their ways, but my hunch here and my worry at the same time, this commercialization is that diluting the essence, because when we talk about spirituality, no doubt we are in the capitalist market-driven economy, but do we then capitalize, do we then commodify spirituality, do we then commodify meditation? Is that going to dilute the cultural essence of India, or does that make India stronger in international scenario? Again, that is something which needs to be debated very seriously. Talking in terms of classical music, classical dance, yes, again, in 2016 there was great event in China wherein Indian classical dancers and the Chinese dancers, they collaborated, and then they had excellent, like there was 10 hours of performance which was carried out. So this is much more civil society initiatives, and as again Aniji pointed out, from state-centric initiatives to then institution-centric initiatives, and now majorly civil society initiatives or group-based initiatives are important. More importantly, what is the role of the state then in the present day scenario? Is the state going to be a facilitator? Because including infrastructure, including the financial assistance is something, like I can share my experience. Recently I went for the conference in Germany wherein I talked about Indian pilgrimage, and the conference was on pilgrimage. And I was encountered with this question, are you a state delegate here? because there were 30 delegates from 24 countries, and only one country which did not send the state delegate is India. And again, this is something which gets connected to our idea of secularism. The moment we start talking about state delegation to study pilgrimage, it absolutely becomes communal. How does this become communal? And the countries who proclaim themselves to be secular are funding very seriously their own academicians to work and preserve the data, to preserve their own culture. Now, this is something very interesting. Even like talking about Germany, the way Germans preserve their heritage, even though, so it's very contradictory that on the one hand, there is constant quest to forget the memory of Second World War, but also there is Holocaust Museum. So how do we then understand forgetting and emphasizing the memory? We Indians, like, especially because I come from Maharashtra, what has happened to the force of Shivaji? Is that a point of soft power? So what, commercially speaking, this corporate collaboration is something wherein we need to preserve, and we need to first start understanding ourselves to understand the other. So this is what I found out.
I'll just add one to what you said. I agree with all your points on spirituality and things. But when it comes to herbal drugs, I am purposely avoiding the word Ayurveda, by the way.
Okay.
I have worked in that area for a very long time. When we are talking of herbal medicines, no doubt that they are very useful. Our health, really it has taken care of it. Then let us not try to put it in the modern frame of the medicine. Use them. In the effect, outside India, our herbal medicine system is not recognized as medicines. Whatever we export is either nutraceuticals or cosmetics or in that. You believe me, Indian medical system, medicine system is not recognized anywhere as official medical system. Because the moment you do that, you need to take the help of the FDA and all approvals. So, as far as the traditional medicines are concerned, let us continue to do it because they are useful. We are proud of it. Let us not try to put it in the framework of modern medicine. Recent report of JAMA, we said metals in the medicines are dangerous. Where most of our medicines are metals, so what difference it makes? As long as you are feeling well, there is no bad effect, don't worry about it. Only don't try to put it in the modern way of frame of medicine, that's all. If we do it, there is a great future for our Indian herbal preparation. Sorry to this.
Yes, what? Okay.
I can just simply respond to
Okay, then yeah.
So maybe we are on the same point, and that was my point to talk about. If there is so much of criticism, even of pharmaceutical, wherein we are using same components with some different nomenclature, that itself has been criticized so heavily. So, considering the global market, there is so much of competition that the current modern medicine is going to question and counter question Ayurveda. So we need to look at the ways in which we can actually, and again, talking one aspect is definitely commercialization, and second aspect is far more. So where we have understood that allopathy and its side effects. Ayurveda, can we have an alternative medicine at all? So if we can talk about alternative paradigms in every sense, why can't we think in terms of alternative medical paradigm? So that is the question which I would like to.
Sorry, my point was not about Ayurveda, but I wanted to give an anecdote which I find is important because we are at College of Engineering. It was not about diaspora, so I didn't mention it. But in 2015, at the beginning of 2015, we had an agreement signed between Tel Aviv University and College of Engineering Pune. And for the summer program, one student, he was hardly 20 years old, I forgot his name, whether Praveen, he visited Israel, and the same year Prime Minister Modi announced International Yoga Day. And this young guy of 20 years old guy, and there were, I believe there were students, foreign students from many countries in Israel, but this guy decided to celebrate International Yoga Day in Israel in Tel Aviv University. Of course, Indian Embassy was doing something, but he tossed this idea to Tela University. They like this idea, and he mobilized more than 100 people in Tela University, and all of them perform yoga. So this is what one inspired and motivated one student can do, and this is how people to people relations, and they take, and there is the importance of you projecting soft power. It's not necessarily always the state has to project its soft power. Many times patriotic and passionate individuals with some support of state or even without support of state can do it. And all of you, if you go outside and visit any whichever country you want, remember you are not one person, but you are representing a country of 1.3 billion people. So that is you can.
I landed in Singapore. This is like almost 20 years back again, first time, and I took some money. I got some money change, and I think wherever I went, it was about $19 something, and that taxi fellow made me wait for a couple of minutes. He was searching the change everywhere and gave me the exact change back. And then he could see, I'm new to Singapore. He said, no, it's not about anything else. What will you think about Singapore, right? The kind of pride we need to carry, and I think then we'll be able to prove it. I'll just do a time check. How much time do we have? A couple of more questions we can ask the audience as well. So we are already consumed more time, right? So I think I'll just should I? Yeah, maybe we can have questions for 10 minutes max, and then maybe we can 5 minutes. 5 minutes. So.
Two or three questions, ma'am.
Yeah, 2 questions. Yeah, maybe you can ask from there. Your voice is loud enough?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please.
So my question to you is,
To who? Yeah.
We have talked about the eminent education models around the world, that is Philippines and USA, Germany. So ma'am, what I have analyzed about the education model is their education system is totally dependent on their culture. But when we try to do that, implement that cultural education in our society, the thing arises is the oppositions come with a religion card, and there और हमने जितनी भी बार ट्राई किया वो चीज़ कोलैप्स हो जाती है, कहीं सेक्युलरिज्म के नाम पे, कहीं रिलीजन के नाम पे. So how can we eradicate this thing?
Thank you for this question. I think since we are, and the best part about market-driven economy and the very simplistic economic understanding, demand and supply. More you demand, and it is then our and the present generation who needs to demand maybe the learning of Sanskrit. Why our MBBS colleges are filled and then there is no admissions in the Ayurvedic colleges, and who is to be blamed for? And more than blame game, I feel at the same time we also need to look at the market. So it goes in circle. If I want to go for Sanskrit, am I assured of job there? And what kind of job will I land in? Is that good enough to win me bread and butter? Something similar with respect to yoga, something similar with respect to Ayurveda. So something similar with respect to even classical dancing and singing. So whatever we are doing here, whatever is Indian, we take that as side course. If I want to do Sanskrit, I'll do something else, maybe engineering, and then side by side I'll do spoken Sanskrit. So this is something which is, then whatever we have is not becoming the mainstream, but that is always on the backdrop or on the sidelines. So maybe it is us who need to start demanding and then creating opportunities also in terms of job opportunities.
We say that we all talk about that culture is a one part of soft power, and I think architecture is also included in that. We have great heritage regarding the architecture from ancient time in India. Other countries try to preserve their historical monuments and architecture, all those things. But while building global market complexes or sculptures, monuments, we are approaching builders and designers from other countries like UAE and France. Then, does it harmful for our Indian culture, or we think our Indian architecture as a soft power?
Is that question directed to me?
Not.
I would like to take it.
I don't think really we invite architects from abroad. Most of the new buildings that have come up, except the cement, high-rising cement blocks, I think we are designing our own institutes. Isn't it?
The designers, most of the time what happens, we are approaching to the UAE and France designers.
Now perhaps your information may not be correct. Only the thing which we are lacking is not the architect, not this thing, but the real town planning. If you talk of town planning, Pune Municipal Corporation could not hire an Indian advisor or Indian consultant for last 3 years. There we are lacking. But in terms of architecture and everything, I think we are trying to preserve our architect heritage is really good. They are trying to impose that on even in the new research institutes that are coming up. But what we lack is the town planning consultant and those kinds, not architect.
Thanks. I think we'll have to close because we are already consumed more time than what we have allotted. I thank all the 4 panelists. I think each of them has much more to tell us. I have at least 2 questions to ask to each of them. But in the interest of time, we'll close it here. Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you.